I'm Rabbi Danny Saxteen of the Sunny Road Kahila in Johannesburg, South Africa. We've just had the 85th Yortzeit of Rabbi Elchonon Wasserman. Rabbi Elchonon Wasserman was murdered by the Nazis on the 12th of Tammuz, 1941. And I would like to pay tribute to his life and legacy. I think there's so much to learn from his incredible life that he lived, and to understand where he came from and how he had a tremendous influence on the Jewish world 100 years ago and all the way up until today, where we certainly feel the great impact of his contribution and his towering light as a leader of the Jewish world. Rabbi Elchonon was a unique person in that he was a very impressive person to look at. He was a very good-looking man. He had a bearing of an aristocrat, even though he was not a wealthy man, but he carried the honor, the kavod of the Torah, and there was a sense of majesty and royalty in his presence from his kedusha and from his connection to Hashem. He was a very strong person, and he stood up for the honor of Torah and for the truth of Hashem's word in this world, and for the importance of Jews to remain connected and strong and loyal to our covenant at Sinai. And so many drew from his tremendous strength, both in Eastern Europe, in Lithuania, where he was the Rosh Yeshiva, and also in the United States. Let's take a short journey together and pay tribute to the life and legacy of Rabbi Elchonon Wasserman, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Livrocha. Rabbi Elchonon was born in the year 1875 in a small town in Lithuania. And in 1888 he went to Volozhin. Remember, Volozhin closed in 1892. So Rabbi Elchonon saw the tail end of Volozhin, and it had a tremendous impact on him. Volozhin closed because the Netziv and Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, who were the Rosh Yeshiva at the time, felt that due to the onerous restrictions of the Tsarist, anti-Semitic Tsarist government in Russia, it was impossible for the yeshiva to stay open, and they decided it would be better to close the yeshiva. The Tsarists knew that through the power of Volozhin, the kedusha of Torah would remain alive and spread to the rest of the Jewish world. They were right about that, but they had already, it was already too late for them, because Volozhin was open for almost 100 years. And in that time, as it was known as the intellectual factory of the Jewish people. And it produced the future leaders of Klal Yisrael, who went back to their towns, opened their own great yeshivas, and the Torah remained alive and strong and vibrant in Klal Yisrael due to the mother of all yeshivas, Volozhin, started by Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, and producing a whole new generation of Torah leaders. Rabbi Elchonon was privileged to catch the last 4 years of Volozhin, which had an indelible impact on him and in his life. The hallmark of Volozhin was that it certainly held very high by the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Belun, who was the Rosh Yeshiva, and Rav Chaim Soloveitchik was married to the Netziv's granddaughter. The two of them were, although they had very different styles, they were loyal to the Kedusha of Torah, to the emes of Torah. In Torah, like in any other academic pursuit, there's a temptation sometimes to say something exciting and something novel, to produce a paper, to produce a new idea. This is a very common feature in the sciences and academia, to come up with something, exciting and something that will turn heads, but is not always true. It's the same in Torah. You can come up with the shtickle Torah that's very dramatic and very eye-catching, but isn't necessarily true. Volozhin was very against that, and they always made it very clear that the role of the Torah scholar is to find the emes. Much of what I'm saying to you comes from my Rebbe, Rabbi Wein Zatzal, and Rabbi Wein had a Rebbe who was a Talmid of Volozhin, One of his rabbis was Rabbi Mendel Kaplan. He speaks so beautifully and so endearingly about him. Was Rabbi Wan's Rebbe when he was in the yeshiva in Chicago. And he said that Rabbi Kaplan would say that Rabbi Elchonon would often tell them, his students, our job is only to know what is written and what do they mean in the holy texts, and not necessarily to come up with our own chidushim and our own exciting and dramatic divrei Torah. And Rabbi Elchonon stayed very true to that principle his whole life. In all of his writings, you can see he's not trying to be fancy. He's not trying to show you how clever he is. He is remaining true to the emes. And he'll describe in Kobesh Shiurim, in Kobesh Mamarim, in Kobesh Se'aros, these his famous Sforim that we have of Rabbi Elchonon. He would describe very complicated ideas in a short amount of words, in 3 or 4 lines, where others would take 4 or 5 pages and they'd make a whole elaborate story out of it. Rabbi Elchonon remained very clear and very true to the emes throughout his life and throughout his teaching of Torah. Rabbi Elchonon, after Volozhin, and Volozhin Shiva closed, he went to Tels, and he was a Talmid of the 2 great Rosh Yeshiva in Tels at the time, Rabbi Eliezer Gordon and Rabbi Shimon Shkop. Rabbi Shimon Shkop was Rabbi Eliezer Gordon's nephew by marriage, and they too also had a great impact on his life, on his outlook, and on his learning. After Volozhin closed in 1892, it's the same year that the Beis HaLevi, Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, passed away. He was the Rabbi of Brisk at the time. And after the Beis HaLevi passed away, so his son Reb Chaim, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, went back to his father's town, to Brisk-Litovsk, to become the rabbi in the town. After Tels, Rabbi Elchonon spent a significant amount of time with the Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim would go in the summer to a town called Libava in Latvia. He would spend a few weeks there in the summer, 2 months or so, and Rabbi Elchonon spent that time with him in 1897 and 1898. And Rabbi Elchonon said, as a result of that time he spent with Reb Chaim, he was able to get a true grasp of Reb Chaim's methodology in learning. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik transformed the Torah world with a whole new approach to lamdas and a whole new vocabulary in learning. And Rabbi Elchonon said that he got a comprehensive grasp of Reb Chaim's view, Reb Chaim's approach in those years that he spent with him. In 1899, he was 24 years old. He married the daughter of Rabbi Meir Atlas. Rabbi Meir Atlas was one of the great Rabbonim in Lithuania at the time. He was the rabbi of Salant. He was the rabbi of Shavel in Lithuania, both 2 very prestigious positions. And he himself was a very accomplished, great Talmid Chacham and an Adam Gadol. Rabbi Elchonon married his daughter Michle, and as was the custom at the time, the son-in-law would move in with his in-laws and would remain there in order to continue his learning, not having to worry to earn money and make a living. He could continue focusing on his learning uninterrupted in the first few years of marriage. Today we have kollel, and we try and set our kids up that they can learn for a few years in kollel, Adil in Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh. In those days they would move into the in-laws, and that would enable the son-in-law to continue his learning. Rabbi Elchonon was already by then noticed and renowned and recognized as a great Talmid Chacham and one of the upcoming stars in the rabbinic world. He was offered a number of different positions, and he turned them all down, and he used the famous Talmudic term with regards to kashrus, kaboilo kach poltoi. So kaboilo kach poltoi means that as something was absorbed, the amount that was absorbed in the pot is the amount that will be extracted from the pot, and also it means the way it was absorbed, the method of heat through which it was absorbed is the method of heat through which it will be extracted. So Rabbi Elchonon would say, Kaboilo kach polto, that which has been absorbed is that which will come out. And if an insufficient amount has been absorbed, so when it's time to give out, there won't be enough there in order to make an impact. And so he was not rushing to take up any of these offers that came his way, and he remained there with his in-laws for 4 years after he and Michla were married, and only in 1903 did he assume his first position in a town called Amshilov. Amshilov had a rov, and they opened a yeshiva, and they approached Rabbi Elchonon to be the Rosh Yeshiva in Amshilov, and he accepted the position. So as we know, great, brilliant people aren't necessarily brilliant teachers. Sometimes a person who's got a great mind doesn't have the capacity to communicate clearly that which is so clear to him or to her. And also sometimes great minds aren't necessarily very good authors and educators. Rabbi Elchonon was blessed in all three of these areas. Not only was he a great, brilliant person, but he was an outstanding orator. He very clearly and succinctly explained complicated ideas, and he was also an outstanding educator. In that, he was able to see the students and see the different types of students and the different needs of the students, and he was able to give each student that which that student needed for their development and growth. So he really was a natural educator, a natural Rosh Yeshiva, somebody who had the ability to share the depth and wisdom and clarity of Torah, but also he had an EQ to see his students and the needs and personalities of the different students. And as a result of all of these great gifts that he was blessed with, he was very successful as a Rosh Yeshiva, and in 2 years the yeshiva grew extensively in Amshilov. However, often we saw in Lithuania, when the town had a rov and the town then had a Rosh Yeshiva, often there was conflict between the two, because as human beings are, as communities go, we know that different people gravitate to different individuals, and it becomes a little difficult if they're two great people, and especially with Rav Elchonon being a young, up-and-coming Talmid Chacham, it probably wasn't easy for the Rav, and there was a bit of tension. And Rav Elchonon saw this, and he preempted it. In the towns where the Rav and Rosh was the same person, like in Volozhin, like in Tels, like in Slobodka, like in Mir, so it worked really well. But when there was a Rav Rosh Yeshiva, sometimes it wasn't so smooth. Rav Elchonon, being the honest person he was, being the sincere person he was an exemplary personality. He didn't want to be in a place which would be harmful, where there would be negativity, and so he decided to leave and went back to his in-laws in 1905. In 1907, Rabbi Elchonon did something which changed his life and which had an indelible effect on him. He writes about it, and he went to Radin to learn by the Chofetz Chaim. The Chofetz Chaim started a kollel of kochim in Radin. The Chofetz Chaim, who was a Kohen, felt that it was the times of Mashiach. In 1907, the Chofetz Chaim felt that. So imagine what the Chofetz Chaim would say today, 120 years later, 119 years later, how incredibly close we are to Mashiach. He felt, he sensed, he could see the energy of the time that Mashiach was near. And Kal v'chomer today, where the world's gone crazy, hasn't it? And the world's upside down, and there's no question that we're in the times of Mashiach. The Chofetz Chaim felt that since that was the case, if Mashiach came and the Bayis Shlishi is built, so we need to know all the halachas of the korbanos, of kochim. And the masechtas of kochim were not so popular in the yeshivas. The yeshivas learn a number of masechtas called the machzor. They learn, it's usually about a 7-year cycle, and kochim's not in that. So the Chofetz Chaim was concerned that the halachas of kochim would not be known, all the many intricate, complicated halachas that are necessary for the avodah, for the service in the Beis HaMikdash, would not be well known by the Rabbanim when Mashiach comes. And so he set up a kollel to study only kochim, and he only wrote his Chidushei Torah, his comments on Shas, in kochim, in order to encourage the learning of kochim. Rabbi Elchonon joined him from 1907 to 1910, and that was completely life-changing to Rabbi Elchonon. He, different neshamas, as we mentioned earlier, gravitate to the different shoresh neshamas, as it's called. Rav Elchonon saw the Chofetz Chaim, and he knew this was his Rebbe. He knew this was it. And from that moment on, he attached himself to the Chofetz Chaim, and every major decision that he would make would go through the Chofetz Chaim, and he became very, very close to the Chofetz Chaim. Even in 1910, when he left Radin, he would still come back for many years for the Yom Noraim to daven by the Chofetz Chaim, and actually he became very the conduit to the Chofetz Chaim. When the Chofetz Chaim got older, and the Chofetz Chaim passed away in 1933, the last number of years of his life, when he was very frail and old, Rabbi Elchonon was the connection to the Chofetz Chaim, and his representative to the outside world. When the Jews, I heard Rabbi Kron say that when the Jews of Europe, the Chofetz Chaim, he first was going to go to the United States. His son said, you need to go to the United States because there's so many new immigrants in the United States, and they're losing their Torah mitzvahs. We need to establish a stronghold, a foundation of Torah in America. We know from 1880 to 1920, 2 million Jews left Eastern Europe and went to the United States, and most of them lost their Torah and were no longer observant because it was just too difficult in the United States. So Chofetz Chaim's son said, you have to go there in order to strengthen and build Torah in America. He was planning to go, and it didn't work out. Then he was planning to go to Eretz Yisrael. When he was planning to go to Eretz Yisrael, the Rabbonim in Europe went to the Chofetz Chaim and said, Rebbe, you the Gadol Ador, you the leader of the Jewish world, and the center of the Jewish world here in Europe, you can't leave us. He said, no, don't worry, it will be fine. You've got Rabbi Elchonon. Rabbi Elchonon will be your leader, and that's just fine. So we see how Rabbi Elchonon was held in the eyes, in the light of the Chofetz Chaim. So he spent that time in Radin with the Chofetz Chaim, and Rabbi Wein's late father-in-law, Rabbi Levine, who was a ben bais by the Chofetz Chaim when he was an orphan, his parents died. His older sister took him to the house of the Chofetz Chaim and said, our parents have died, you have to look after my brother. Chofetz Chaim said, okay. Took him in, and then he went to the dorms of the yeshiva. Was very, very close to the Chofetz Chaim. So Rabbi Levine said that Rabbi Elchonon, he actually imitated the movements of the Chofetz Chaim, the mannerisms of the Chofetz Chaim, the way he spoke, the way he moved his hands, the way he engaged with people was very much like the Chofetz Chaim. So both consciously and subconsciously, he modeled himself on the Chofetz Chaim, and that was life-changing for him. In 1910, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik started a yeshiva in Brisk, and he appointed Rabbi Elchonon as one of the Rosh Yeshiva. Rabbi Elchonon went, and he actually became the conduit between Radin and Brisk, and the Talmidim would go from Brisk to Radin and vice versa as a result of Rabbi Elchonon. In 1914, World War I breaks out, and the Jews of Brisk, which is the city, as mentioned, of is Brest-Litovsk, it was very near the border where the front lines were. The Russians suspected the Jews of being disloyal, and because of that, they forced the Jews to leave. Tell me something new. Of course, everybody always blames the Jews for everything, and so the Russians said that the Jews would be dangerous and the Jews would side with our enemies, and so they banished the Jews from the front lines, which was pretty much in the Pale of Settlement. So the concentration of Jews in Eastern Europe, most of those areas is where very close to where the front lines were in World War I, and those Jews were then turned to it. They were sent away. They were turned into exile by the Russians. They became refugees, and it became very, very difficult at that time. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were evicted overnight from their homes. They wandered as refugees. Tens of thousands died. The Chofetz Chaim was also forced to leave, and Rabbi Elchonon, who was forced to leave Brisk, joined the Chofetz Chaim, and they came to a town called Smilovitz, which is near Minsk. And Rabbi Elchonon moved the yeshiva to Smilovitz. When the war came closer to Smilovitz and came further east, the Chofetz Chaim went further east as well. The Chofetz Chaim left Smilovitz, but Rabbi Elchonon stayed, and he kept his yeshiva going there until almost 1920, which was an incredible achievement because the level of suffering, the starvation, the war, the pogroms, the anti-Semitism, the Russian Revolution, that it was all happening, and it's just unthinkable what they went through and what they had to face, these people. Rabbi Elchonon and his wife were the mother and father of the yeshiva. They kept everything solid and together. They even had the flu epidemic of 1919 where thousands died, and they were the incredible mainstay. Rabbi Elchonon is known as the Iron Man of the Jewish people, because despite the almost unbearable conditions, he always kept going with tremendous emunah and with tremendous devotion, dedication to Torah and to Hashem. When the war was over, the yeshivas moved back to Poland, and they wanted to get out of Russia, because Russia was now controlled, of course, by the communists who were anti-Semitic. And we see a rise in anti-Semitism today in the world, largely coming from the far left radicals, which are communists. So there's a long history of anti-Semitism from the communist movement, and a lot of today's anti-Semitism has its roots over there. And of course, it's blamed as anti-Zionism and the genocidal state of Israel. But that's where the roots of the far left anti-Semitism, and of course it's joined with the Islamic anti-Semitism as well. So, that's a familiar story, isn't it? We thought in the 20th and 21st century we were over the scourge of anti-Semitism, but boy, is it back, and back with a vengeance, unfortunately. So the yeshivas wanted to get out of the clutch, the grasp of the communists, because they made life very difficult for them. And so now they began to move further west. And they came to a town, Rabbi Elchonon came to a town called Baranovich. Baranovich, at that time, there were 30,000 people. About half of the population was Jewish. And he established the yeshiva over there. He set up his yeshiva in Baranovich. And the Chofetz Chaim actually was very glad about that. Chofetz Chaim said that in the early previous years, under the rule of the Tsar, Jews weren't allowed to live in Baranovich. And he said now there's a thriving Jewish population with a wonderful yeshiva under Rabbi Elchonon. Between the wars, so there was great economic deprivation and difficulty in the whole world, but especially in Europe. And it was at that time that the European Roshei Yeshiva started going to America to raise money, to fund their yeshivas and fund their communities. And that's how the great Rosh Yeshivas, Rav Meir Shapira, Rav Shimon Shkop, Rav Kook, Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein from Slobodka, they all arrived in America in order to fundraise for their yeshivas. And although there were hard times also after the Great Depression, etc., but the dollars they raised in America went a very long way back in Europe, and it was certainly worth their while. Rav Elchonon's time in America was very significant, because Rav Elchonon, he was such a man of truth and such a man of faith that he felt that the lax standards in America were unacceptable. And many of the American Rabbonim felt that, what future is there to orthodoxy in this new world in America? And so what we have, but, we'll make the best of what we got, but, there's not much we can do. Rav Elchonon saw it differently. And he said that we cannot lower our standards, and the Torah will survive, and the Torah will thrive, and we will see Torah built in America. And so he was very outspoken wherever he went when he saw that there was a drop in standards. And the Rabbonim in America, many of them testified that when Rav Elchonon told them to do something, they did it. And he was able to give a tremendous amount of chizuk to the Rabbonim in America, to the Kehillas in America. And he stood tall and fought hard for halacha, for Torah, for uncompromising observance of the Shulchan Aruch and of Torah. And if Rav Elchonon saw America today, he would be vindicated, because we see how he was right, and how Torah has been built in America, and how we have, thank God, amazing, thriving kahillas, yeshivas, Torah, which is very strong, and growing in America. So Rabbi Elchonon really was right. And those standards that he set were significant in ensuring that the Torah was upheld and was safeguarded in America. Rabbi Elchonon wrote an amazing work. It's a very small book, like a pamphlet, an essay, maybe we could call it, called Ikvas de Mashiach. My old version of Chofetz Chaim doesn't have it, but the newer version, my son just got a newer version because we learn it together. In the back of his Chofetz Chaim is this pamphlet, this article, this essay called Ikvas de Mashiach that Rabbi Elchonon wrote. Ikvasa means Ekev, a heel, the footsteps of Mashiach. Rabbi Elchonon's view was so clear, was almost prophetic, frightening how clear his understanding of the situation was then in the 1930s. And he writes very clearly that he feels that there's great danger facing the Jewish world as a result of the secularism of the Jewish world, as a result of secular nationalism. That means secular Zionism, that the Jewish world is going to fracture and is going to be destroyed. And we need to desperately return to Torah and mitzvahs, because that is the covenant of the Jews with Hashem. And if we turn our backs on our covenant, so the results are disastrous. There will be very severe consequences. The consequences will be very severe, and we will face the destruction of European Jewry. Rabbi Elchonon writes this in the 1930s. It's just unbelievable how accurate he was, how clear he was. And he said he certainly felt that Hitler was the avenging angel who would be the one who would bring about this destruction. So he was not, unlike many of the time, he was not naive, and he could see the writing on the wall, and he wrote that very clearly. And the Rabbonim in the United States, he was actually in America in 1938, that late, just before the war broke out. And the Rabbonim said to him, stay, don't go back. There's disaster in Europe. There's a dark cloud on the horizon. And Rabbi Elchonon was not naive about it. He agreed. He said, absolutely, as we see in his writings. But he said, how could I leave my people? How could I leave my yeshiva, my Talmidim? How could I leave the Kehillah in Europe? And he went back. And he went back knowing very well what he was going back to and what the future held. But he felt that that's what he had to do. Rabbi Wein said that he spoke to many eyewitnesses that were at the docks that saw Rabbi Elchonon off in 1938. And they told Rabbi Wein that the look on his face and the look on their faces, they knew that the end was near. It was just, it was just brutal that they knew they would not see him again, and he knew he would not see them again. And so Rabbi Elchonon goes back to Eretz Yisrael, and he goes back to Europe, and the result was unfortunately very, very sad. So Rabbi Elchonon, just to mention one more thing before we talk about the very tragic end of his life. So Rabbi Elchonon was offered many different rabbinic positions throughout his life, and in 1926 his father-in-law, Rabbi Meir Atlas, died. And as mentioned, he was the Rav of Shovel, which was a very prestigious position in Lithuania, and they offered the job to Rabbi Elchonon. And his wife wanted him to take up the position, a tribute to her father, and also as a Rosh Yeshiva, he had to fundraise extensively. It was very, very difficult for them financially, and this position would be much more comfortable. He would have a guaranteed salary which would support the family much better. And so he didn't want to leave the yeshiva. His wife wanted him to take the position, and so they decided that they would go and ask the Chofetz Chaim, and whatever the Chofetz Chaim would say, they would do. And when they were waiting at the train station to go to Radin, so Rabbi Elchonon looked to his wife and said, how could I leave the yeshiva? I can't possibly leave the yeshiva. And she could see the tears in his eyes. And she said to him, I understand. We will stay in Baranovich. We will stay with the yeshiva, and you'll stay with your Talmidim. And so that's why he didn't take up his father-in-law's position. Rabbi Elchonon was always very outspoken. He, as mentioned, a man of truth, and he never deviated from the truth. And when things needed to be said, in other words, when things were fracturing in terms of Yiddishkeit, he always stood up in a very strong way, and an uncompromising way, and he was very outspoken. And people said to him, maybe you should tone it down a little bit, because that affects your fundraising. People know how strongly you speak about certain topics, and that rubs people up the wrong way. So maybe tone it down a bit. It would help you with your fundraising. Rabbi Elchonon answered them. He said, I built a yeshiva to bring the truth of Torah to the world. I didn't build a yeshiva in order to be able to fundraise. And therefore, fundraising is a periphery thing. The main focus is the truth of Torah. And I won't compromise on that. And so was his attitude. And certainly that's probably why he was so highly respected and his impact was so dramatic in the Jewish world. Rabbi Elchonon writes so brilliantly, and I think it's such a important point for our times as well. He says, with the war with Hitler and the aggression of the Nazis, and with the depression in the 1930s, which was what was going on in the world at that time, he says the reason for these crises has the same root. And the root is a lack of faith in God. When we have a lack of faith in God, so then we don't have faith in anything. And we don't have faith in our fellow man. And that causes economies to crash, and that causes wars between nations. And the root of it all is our lack of faith in God. And I think it's the same today. We see in the world that the world is a crazy place. And there's some absolutely ridiculous ideas out there. And it seems like we've lost our bearing and our sense of perspective in the world. And the reason most probably is because of what Rabbi Elchonon is saying, is because we don't have faith in God. And when we lose faith in God and a creator and a higher moral system, so then anything can go. And we could justify any behavior, and any means are accepted in order to achieve the so-called ideal and goal, which unfortunately leads to great human suffering and war, which, please God, will not be the case. When the war broke out in the 1st of September 1939, so many of the yeshivas went to, so remember the Molotov and Ribbentrop Pact between the Nazis and the Russians, they split Poland into two. And Vilna still at that time remained an international city. It was first it was the Russians, and then first it was controlled by the Poles, and then the Russians, and it remained independent. They went back to the Russians, but Vilna seemed to be a haven, and Rav Chaim Grudzinski advised the yeshivas, and Rav Elchonon agreed to go to Vilna. And most of the yeshivas went to Vilna because it was still an international city. And many of them then went to Kovno and got visas from Sampi Sugihara, from the Japanese consulate. They actually got visas from Curacao. It's now the World Cup, and Curacao is playing in the World Cup. I was very excited about it because it's a very unknown Dutch island in the Caribbean. And they offered visas. The Jews were able to get visas to Curacao, and they needed the transit visas from which they got from Sugihara in the Japanese consul. And they were then given, since they had their transit visas, they could travel through Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railway and get to Kobe in Japan, and then to Shanghai in China. And that's what saved the Mir Yeshiva and so many others in this method. And Rabbi Elchonon encouraged as many as possible to get those visas. He went to Kovno also, and he was staying at the home of Rav Aram Grudzinski, who was the mashgiach of the Slobodka Yeshiva. He was the father-in-law of Rav Kreisvitz Zatzal. And what happened when the Nazis attacked the Russians, Operation Barbarossa, June the 23rd, 1941. So very quickly the Nazis rounded up the leaders of the Jewish communities in the towns that they occupied. And that was one of their first tactics to demoralize and crush the Jewish communities, was to take their leaders and murder their leaders. And Rabbi Elchonon was one of the most well-known Rabbonim at the time in the world, and he was on their list. And they were looking for him. And so he was hiding in Rav Aaron Brzezinski's home. And I actually have been there. So Slobodka is a suburb of Kovno. Kovno is the second largest city in Lithuania. You cross the river, and there's the suburb of Slobodka where Slobodka Yeshiva was. And Rav Aaron Brzezinski's home was there. The same home is still standing, this wooden home. I stood outside that home, the place where Rav Elchonon was found. And there was a Lithuanian policeman together with an SS soldier. And so the Nazis, when they came in, they had many collaborators, many sympathizers in the local populations where they went, certainly amongst the Lithuanians. And together, they worked together in order to round up the Jews, in order to murder the Jews. And in many instances, the Nazis didn't have to do much at all. They just left it to the Lithuanians. So they saw a number of students, yeshiva students, coming out of this house. And they thought it looked suspicious that maybe some of the leaders were there. And they went to the house and they saw Rav Elchonon. They recognized him because he was on the list of leaders that they were searching for. And apparently the story goes, I heard this also from Rabbi Kron. I heard it, I was there with Rabbi Kron. So he said this standing at the house where Rav Elchonon was taken. He said that the Lithuanian said, this is him. The Nazi was moved by the Hadras Panim. Rav Elchonon he had a very powerful image. To see him had a great effect on people. And so the Nazi was moved by the presence of Rav Elchonon. And he said to the Lithuanian, let's just leave him, let's go. And the Lithuanian said, no, this is the Rabbiner, this is the rabbi we want. And they took him. They took him to the 7th fort. There were a number of forts around Kovno, and those were used by the Nazis to gather the Jewish community, the Jewish leaders. They were like the holding cells of the leaders of the Jews until they murdered them. And then the next day, there's a bit of a discussion which exactly was the day that Rav Elchonon was murdered. Was it the 11th of Tammuz, was the 12th, was the 13th? But most seem to say it was the 12th of Tammuz. And they held them overnight, and then they marched them out of this holding area and through like a bit of a tunnel of the fort and out into the forest, the countryside next to the fort, and that's where they mowed them down with machine guns. Rav Elchonon told the people that he was with that we are korbanos, and we are an atonement, a kapora for Klal Yisrael and for our brothers and sisters that have left Torah mitzvahs. And in order for a korban to be miskabel, for a korban, for sacrifice to be received, it has to be pure. The intentions of the Kohanim have to be pure. And therefore our intentions, we are korbanos, have to be pure. And we should have in mind that we're dying al Kiddush Hashem, and that our death should be a kapora for all of Klal Yisrael. And so that's how he instructed those around him, Rabbi Elchonon, and they took them, and I walked that route. And I was, in our trip to Poland, Lithuania, I was quite stoic and strong, even in Auschwitz, which is very brutal, all these places. But that's where I completely broke down, because I knew that was where, he walked and where he was murdered, Rabbi Elchonon. And so he met a brutal end at the hand of the Nazis and the Lithuanian collaborators. Rabbi Elchonon was, his son Reb Simcha survived, and his other son Reb Moshe survived. I feel a very strong connection to Rabbi Elchonon probably because of Reb Simcha, and also because I absolutely love his Torah and his Sforim. So I was privileged enough to learn in Osameach Yeshiva. And when I was there, Rav Simcha would give a shir twice a week, and I went whenever he was there, Rav Simcha, and it was just a great privilege. It was seeing. I didn't know much. I was a very new Baal Tshuva, but to see this man who was gentle and kind and sincere and a tremendous Talmid Chacham, and we asked him all of our questions, and some of them were ridiculous and some of them were good questions, and he dealt with us gently. He dealt with us kindly. He answered everything in the best way he could. I remember actually and I was zocher to eat in his home, and he and his wife. I remember thinking, I've never seen a marriage like this of Reb Simcha and his wife, Reb Fegi. They were just so beautiful together and so kind to each other. and had such a beautiful connection. They were already very old when I met them, when I was there, but I was very touched by their relationship and by their respect for each other and by their incredible bond. And I remember I was with somebody who asked Rav Simcha a question about Kabbalah, like a Kabbalistic question. Rav Simcha said, I'm not really well educated in those areas. And his wife burst out laughing. And she said to him, if you can't answer his question, who can answer his question? And so then he went and answered the question with some deep Kabbalah. So yeah, it was just so beautiful to see. So that's why I always felt very close and very connected to Rav Elchonon through Rav Simcha, and of course through Rav Elchonon's beautiful Torah. Rav Simcha carried the legacy of Rav Elchonon, certainly was a conduit to his father, to the next generation. He was a Rosh Yeshiva in Detroit and in LA. He had many, many Talmidim, and then he and his wife went to Eretz Yisrael at the end of their life. He taught in Osamech, he taught in Or Elchonon, which is yeshiva in Jerusalem, named after Rav Elchonon, and he certainly carried that connection to true Torah, to the light and love of Torah, of Rav Elchonon and of pre-war Europe, to those that were fortunate enough to see him. His other son, Reb Moshe, was an engineer in Brooklyn, so such is the legacy of Rabbi Elchonon Wasserman. And certainly we should all be inspired by his love of Torah, his dedication to Torah and Halacha, his love of Jews, and his shining light that we still bask in 85 years later. May his memory be a blessing for all of us.